When a top NFL insider suggested that Shedeur Sanders did not know as much as teams expected, it was framed as just another scouting note, a harmless evaluation that comes with the territory of breaking into professional football. But for anyone who has been paying close attention to how narratives around young black quarterbacks are formed and weaponized, the comment didn't sound neutral. It felt like something deeper, something older, something all too familiar. It felt like a dog whistle, because the statement wasn't really about playbooks, reps, or knowledge gaps. It tapped directly into an ugly historical narrative that has followed black quarterbacks for generations. The narrative that they are athletic but not cerebral enough, talented but not intelligent enough, explosive playmakers but not capable leaders. The question immediately becomes this: is Shedeur Sanders truly behind in NFL knowledge? Or are we watching the recycling of a centuries-old stereotype designed to keep confident, outspoken black quarterbacks in their place? Because when you peel back the headlines and dive into the context, the numbers, the history, and what the players inside the Browns locker room are actually saying, a very different story comes into focus. Let's start with the source. NFL insider Albert Breer appeared on Cleveland's 92.3 The Fan and told listeners that teams were surprised by how little Shedeur knew relative to what they expected. Breer highlighted that Shedeur, being the son of Deion Sanders and having worked with Pat Shurmur in college, was supposed to arrive with an advanced understanding of the game. That expectation made the claim of his supposed lack of polish sting even more. At first glance, the observation seems innocent. Rookies are always raw. Every quarterback making the jump from college to the NFL faces a steep learning curve. But there's a reason Breer's comment exploded across headlines. Context matters, and timing matters even more. Because while this narrative was being planted, Shedeur Sanders was simultaneously getting fewer practice reps during Browns OTAs than nearly everyone else in the quarterback room. Joe Flacco and Kenny Pickett split time with the starters. Even fellow rookie Dylan Gabriel, a 4-year college starter with 64 games of experience, got more looks with the meaningful units. Shedeur, he was largely relegated to scraps, working with players unlikely to see significant game action. So when Breer casually said Shedeur wasn't mentally ready, the dots connected too neatly. Less reps, less knowledge. Case closed, right? Wrong. Because OTAs in June are not a real measure of quarterback readiness. They are glorified walkthroughs. Coaches are experimenting with rotations, getting veterans back into rhythm, and letting rookies dip their toes in the water. No one locks in depth charts in June. But media narratives, they can cement themselves instantly, especially when the subject is a young black quarterback, and especially when that quarterback carries the weight of both a famous last name and enormous public scrutiny. Cleveland's quarterback room is not straightforward. Deshaun Watson is still recovering from a torn Achilles and remains an unpredictable piece of the puzzle. Joe Flacco, a former Super Bowl MVP, has returned as a veteran safety net. Kenny Pickett, a 2022 first-round pick, was brought in as another layer of depth. Dylan Gabriel is a rookie, but with far more game tape than Shedeur. Add Shedeur Sanders into that mix. Just 24 FBS games on his resume, and it is perfectly logical that he would be lower in the rep order early on. That is simple logistics. But here is where things get dangerous. When you combine that logistical choice with a public narrative about a supposed lack of knowledge, the perception morphs into something else entirely. It's no longer about a rookie being eased in. It becomes an implication, a coded suggestion that Sanders might not be intelligent enough. And that coded suggestion has been used to keep black quarterbacks down for decades. To understand how damaging this is, you have to look at the broader historical pattern. The stereotype of the athletic but not smart enough black quarterback is one of the most persistent forms of coded bias in the NFL. We have seen it play out time and time again, in ways both subtle and overt. Take the 2021 NFL season as a clear snapshot. Carson Wentz, Andy Dalton, and Ryan Fitzpatrick, none of whom were elite, none of whom had MVPs, none of whom had Super Bowl wins, were all starting week 1. Meanwhile, Cam Newton, a black quarterback who had been both an NFL MVP and a Super Bowl starter, couldn't even find a roster spot. That wasn't an isolated fluke. It was part of a consistent pattern where black quarterbacks are scrutinized more harshly, discarded more quickly, and rarely given the same grace that journeyman white quarterbacks enjoy. Look at the careers of Robert Griffin III, Tyrod Taylor, and Jameis Winston. Let's be brutally honest about what's at stake here. Shedeur Sanders isn't just competing for a roster spot or a role on the depth chart. He's competing against a deeply ingrained system of perception that has for decades dictated how black quarterbacks are viewed in the NFL. Every snap, every throw, every decision he makes will be magnified and dissected under a microscope that white counterparts often never have to face. And history has shown us what happens when those narratives go unchecked. Look back at Warren Moon, who was forced to prove himself in the Canadian Football League before the NFL would even give him a chance. Moon went on to become one of the greatest passers in league history, but his journey was delayed and diverted because of stereotypes that said black quarterbacks couldn't handle the mental side of the game. Doug Williams became the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl, but even his historic run with Washington was framed as an exception rather than proof that the old stereotypes were false. Fast forward through Donovan McNabb, Michael Vick, Steve McNair, and more recently Lamar Jackson. Each of them faced the same coded criticisms. They were athletic or dual threat, but rarely praised for their football IQ, pocket presence, or leadership. And in every single generation, these narratives slowed their recognition, delayed their opportunities, or limited their financial rewards. That's the cycle Shedeur Sanders is stepping into, and that's why the framing of his rookie offseason matters so much more than outsiders want to admit. Because perception in the NFL is currency. It dictates who gets reps, who gets patience, who gets second and third chances, and who gets labeled as a bust after one bad game. When Albert Breer made his comment, he didn't need to say anything explicit. The weight of history filled in the blanks. For fans and executives already conditioned by decades of bias, the narrative was confirmed. But when you strip away the stereotypes and look at Sanders objectively, what do you see? You see a quarterback who demonstrated poise and accuracy in one of the worst protection situations in all of college football. You see a player who threw for over 3,200 yards and 27 touchdowns in his final season, despite being sacked a staggering 52 times. You see a leader who, under the blinding media spotlight that comes with being Deion Sanders' son, never lost his composure, never threw teammates under the bus, and never cracked under pressure. That is not the resume of someone who lacks football knowledge or leadership skills. That is the resume of a player who has repeatedly shown resilience, intelligence, and adaptability. But the media rarely sells resilience and adaptability when the subject is a black quarterback. Instead, they highlight the sacks, question the decision-making, or point out how many games were lost. They ignore the context of atrocious offensive line play. They ignore the flashes of brilliance. They ignore the growth. Because the old narrative is easier to recycle. And make no mistake, recycling narratives isn't just lazy, it's dangerous. It can derail careers before they ever begin. Think about how quickly narratives became reality for quarterbacks like Dwayne Haskins, who was labeled immature and unprepared before he ever had a chance to stabilize in the NFL. Think about how Geno Smith was written off after struggling early in his career, only to prove a decade later in Seattle that he could not only play, but thrive. How many years of opportunity were stolen from him because of how he was framed in his early years? Now think about Shedeur. If he's defined by a perception of being behind before he's even given a fair share of reps, his margin for error shrinks to zero. Every incomplete pass in preseason will be weaponized. Every sack he takes will be spun as evidence that he can't process defenses. Every interception will be proof that the narrative was right all along. That's not competition. That's character assassination by narrative. And yet, inside the Browns building, the story looks very different. Reports from teammates highlight Shedeur's composure, his ability to connect with players, and his willingness to put in extra work after practice. Veterans see the grind, not the headlines. Myles Garrett vouched for him publicly. Nick Chubb, one of the quietest leaders in the league, was seen working with him on timing drills. And even Joe Flacco, who could easily view Sanders as a threat to his job security, has been nothing but supportive, praising his questions in meetings and his effort on the field. Inside those walls, Shedeur isn't the outsider portrayed by national media. He's a rookie doing what rookies are supposed to do: learn, absorb, and earn respect. That contrast between internal reality and external perception tells us everything about the machinery of NFL narratives. Because this isn't about Shedeur being unprepared. This is about the